Okay, welcome back to part 2 of this lecture on participatory and media culture and developing frameworks of analysis for game media texts and paratexts. In this part of the lecture, we're going to explore Juice Rayson's chapter on participatory media culture and unpack his second analytical framework that is useful for thinking about how play extends beyond the limitations of the technical experience of the video game text. But it's important to start with the idea of culture and what we mean by culture. Culture is a term for shared behaviors, practices, processes, beliefs, and activities that exists and is different in all human societies. Popular culture includes the activities, feelings, attitudes, and ways of understanding objects that exist in society at a given time. Although much of our popular culture is organized around commodities, culture is more than consumption. We take part in culture through our meaning-making practices. And in his chapter, Rayson is building on his understanding of the ontological dimensions of computer games with a second layer of analysis that draws on the methods of cultural studies to think about participatory media culture of computer game fans through 3 key concepts: interpretation, construction, and reconfiguration. Rayson is using these 3 concepts to examine the participatory media culture of video games. And we're going to look at that in detail. So the first question that we have from this framework is, how do we interpret games? This is where the cultural studies is useful, because cultural studies is interested in the systems in our shared cultures. Cultural studies looks to the way ideology, class structures, organizations, institutions, and national formations operate to shape meaning and interpretation. Cultural studies is also interested in examining issues of race, class, ethnicity, migration, sexual orientation, gender, and generation. Within cultural studies, culture is understood in very flexible terms, and culture is not considered to be fixed or stable, but rather undergoing constant change. Cultural studies is interested in how the everyday and the ordinary is constructed by the divergent social and cultural phenomena, from sports to celebrities, from advertising and pop music to shopping malls. Cultural studies argues that forms of popular culture like computer games are just as important as forms of classical art, opera, and literature. Most importantly, we can take from Rayson's that cultural studies resists the idea that individuals are simply passive receptacles of information. Culture isn't like water. It isn't something that fills us up. And culture means that humans aren't just empty vessels into which culture pours. Audiences are active producers of meaning through the processes of interpretation, which differs depending on multiple contexts, including our own personal backgrounds and things like age and gender and class, and as well as unique community and individual experiences. Culture, as the site where meaning is generated and experienced, becomes a determining, productive field through which social realities are constructed, experienced, and interpreted. View by Turner, cited by Rayson, rejects, or at least pushes back against the notion of what we call media effects theories. This is the idea that, games can make us violent or aggressive in certain ways. It rejects the idea that we are simply programmed by the media we consume. Antonio Francesco Gramsci was an Italian Marxist philosopher, a communist who diverged from the economic determinism of traditional interpretations of Marx, and is well known for his theory of cultural hegemony. Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony is concerned with the state and the ruling capitalist use of cultural institutions to maintain power. Essentially, hegemonic power is used to maintain control through consent rather than force. However, as Turner argues, Gramsci acknowledges the power of the individual human agent within culture by analyzing not only the overdetermining structure that produces the individual, but also the range of possibilities produced for the individual, and I would add by the individual. Hegemonic power and domination are part of cultural expression, but so is the critical and political resistance of audiences against the oppressive power relations, which reveals that culture is in fact a constant struggle. Let's put this in context of video games. One of the cultural struggles involved in the interpretation of video games, argues Raisins, is the way that video game or computer game developers attempt to take advantage of the extensive degrees of multimediality, interactivity, virtuality, and connectivity to create games with systems that have what Douglas Rushkoff calls coercion. The coercive and manipulative power of video games cannot be ignored. This is why we've been talking about microtransactions as being important to the video game industry since the penny arcade era, the pinball era, the video game arcade era, and the current era. Microtransactions like loot boxes are an advanced system of marketing. They deploy sophisticated psychological strategies of coercion to increase consumption through gambling mechanics. Speaking at the video game conference in Helsinki in 2016, the CEO of the games company Tribeflame, Torolf Jernstrom, became infamous in the video game industry for his talk, which revealed many of the tricks that free-to-play mobile games use to encourage players to spend more money while playing. I'll link the video in the subject Moodle page. Highly recommend watching this one. It's a really interesting peer behind the curtain. Raisins' point, however, is that when it comes to the interpretive domain of computer games, the interpretive function of participation is that players are not simply dupes. Players are not stupid, and they are active in decision-making practices. Now, yes, games have a coercive force. We can demonstrate this. But we can also demonstrate that humans have what we call agency. Not necessarily free will, but agency, the ability to make distinctions and to make decisions. Yes, humans can quite easily become addicted to things. However, because of our agency, we also have the capacity to resist or struggle against that addiction. We have the capacity and the ability to choose to help others resist addiction. So on the one hand, games do have a degree of coercion. But on the other, we have this interpretive function where players are able to recognize this coercive power and to engage and respond to that coercive power through the interpretation of cultural products like games. This is fundamental to what it means to be human, is this struggle between addiction and coercion and resistance and agency. Not always successful, but it's still there. This paper by Hall from 1980 explains that cultural productions do not just have one meaning or function, but in the process of creating a text, there is an intended meaning that is encoded into the product. The receiver of the message, however, the consumer of the product, the player of the game, then decodes the experience of that text according to their own personal interpretive framework. And therefore, a new level of meaning is produced that is unique to that individual. Elements of it certainly can be shared amongst that individual in culture, but it is still unique to that individual. Stuart Hall identifies three different strategies of interpretation that he calls decoding or reading. The first is the dominant hegemonic reading, right? This is where the player or the reader or the audience is just receiving the preferred understanding of the text. The second is the negotiated reading, which acknowledges that the dominant reading or the dominant meaning is there, but the player is simultaneously modifying it according to their own personal experiences, preferences, and tastes. The third kind of level of reading, of interpretation, the oppositional reading, in which the person realizes that their personal meaning is not the dominant meaning, and therefore not the meaning that was intended, and actually rejects the intended meaning. I've got a quote here from Raisins. Respectively, these three strategies point out the possibility to read a text according to the dominant ideology, the possibility to negotiate this dominant ideology, and to varying degrees mix adaptive elements with oppositional elements, and the possibility to go against the dominant ideology and come up with a purely oppositional reading. So these three things can be going on at the same time in the act of interpretation. So we've got our first point in the analytical framework. And let's move a bit deeper into this notion of interpretation, because Raisins builds into this analytical framework a kind of deeper layer of interpretation that is connected to construction and reconfiguration. And this is the idea of what he calls deconstruction. Deconstruction is a concept that emerged from the work of French philosopher Jacques Derrida, which refers to the various methods of interpretation that are actively operating to bring elements in a text to the surface, to break through the superficial understanding and disrupt the more mundane elements of its functioning. And I'll give an example of that in a sec. Deconstruction is a form of participation, a form of interpretation. It is a way that players make sense of things that run counter to the intended meaning of a text. Racine says, looking through and exposing the hidden, naturalized, ideological, presupposed rules of media, in my opinion, is a form of participatory media culture. And I want to give an example of that. So Princess Peach is a kind of famous example of the classic damsel in distress. That in the earliest games of Mario is a figure of reward that Mario has to defeat. Donkey Kong has to defeat Bowser in order to win Princess Peach that is turned into an object. Now that starts to get deconstructed by games developers as the series and as the many different games progress. But in many instances, Peach typically falls into this category of the damsel. However, as we will see, the second element of Racin's participatory media framework is reconfiguration. And we'll see how Princess Peach transforms through this example of participatory media culture. So we have one level, interpretation, which involves different ways to read and different ways to deconstruct a text. And that deconstruction starts to emerge in this second part of the analytical framework, reconfiguration. Reconfiguration is usually best seen in what we might call paratexts. Reconfiguration happens through games journalism, for example, right? So games journalists are participatory players. They're playing a game and they're reconfiguring that game experience as another text, right? An article or a video. Reconfiguration also happens on social media when people post screenshots or make memes of games. Reconfiguration is also part of what we see in the rise of Let's Play videos on YouTube over the past 10 years. And of course, live streaming via Twitch and Facebook and Mixer and other platforms. One of the most interesting reconfigurations of games is cosplay. And this is where deconstruction comes into play. So the interpretation of Princess Peach, right? This deconstruction of her as a damsel is totally deconstructed and reconfigured in this example of cosplay from Kinpatsu on Instagram. Here, she is deconstructing the notion of Princess Peach as a damsel and reconstructing her through cosplay as this really cool armored knight, right? This is a protagonist. This is not a passive damsel. What's interesting about this framework is that actually what's going on here is both an example of interpretation and deconstruction of that notion of the damsel, reconstructing that as a new form through Instagram. But the cosplay itself is, I think, on the borderline of the third element of the analytical framework, which is construction. So all of these three things are happening at the same time. They're not separate from one another. Okay, Construction occurs when the processes of deconstruction and reconfiguration result in entirely new texts or paratexts or what we might call metatexts. So that example of that cosplay of Princess Peach, I think, is actually moving through that deconstruction, through that reconfiguration, and is a clear example of construction. There's actual making going on there. So you can't kind of isolate any one of these three instances. That you have, when you think of one, you have to think about the elements of the other. I'm going to end this part of the lecture, and then in the third part of the lecture, I'm going to do a bit more of a discussion about the concept of construction as a participatory media culture. And we're going to focus on two examples, mods or game modifications and machinima.